Welcome to the 9th Summer Solstice series from First Presbyterian Church, Salina. I'm Sydney Soderberg, co-coordinator of the series with Martha Ray. This year's Summer Solstice looks at the aftertime of our year of COVID, with its separating lockdowns and paralyzing political polarity. How do we move forward? How do we open to our new normal? How do we begin to actively and intentionally heal, both individually and in community? Bringing together speakers from across the country, as well as a few more local favorites, we explore this year's theme, Moving to Higher Ground, Practices for Healing. Today is the first session of the series, The Need for Healing, moderated by Dr. Paula Fried. Paula is a clinical psychologist in private practice in Salina, and in addition, she has been involved in numerous and varied community projects, often in a leadership capacity. On a personal note, she is a seasoned cook whose culinary skills are enjoyed widely, and she is actively interested in supporting local producers. Today's panel members are Father Frank Coady, the Reverend Brian Ellison, and Dr. Daniel Yudkin, and they will be introduced by Dr. Fried. And finally, do remember there are two options for participation in this year's series, online and in person. Visit the church's website, www.fpcsalina.org, to learn more. Thank you for joining us. And now, Dr. Fried.
Welcome to the first session in the 2021 Summer Solstice series, Moving to Higher Ground, Rituals for Healing. So much has transpired in the past year since our last series. We experienced the heartbreaking peak of the COVID-19 pandemic, followed by the celebrated release of a vaccination developed at an unprecedented pace, followed by only recently a gradual reopening of the community and return to our previous activities. It has been a challenging year is a common refrain, with words like languishing, anxiety, uncertainty, and fear circling around us. The pandemic resulted in regulations requiring practices that were unfamiliar to us, and we found ourselves divided in new ways. Familiar places like the grocery store felt like contested spaces at times, with a new evident tension between fellow shoppers around mask wearing. Many of us moved through all of this in greater isolation than we had previously experienced, with limited contact with friends and families, often struggling to reconfigure school, work, and daily lives under these new and frightening conditions. We lost and grieved for friends and family members. Then the remarkable rollout of vaccines revealed other divisions between those who felt relief to be vaccinated and those who opposed vaccinations. And against this pandemic backdrop, we elected a new president and a new Congress, which has brought a great sense of anticipation and relief for some, and anger and frustration for others, and even concerns about the legitimacy of the election for still others. We found ourselves using the word unprecedented at an unprecedented rate. How do we move forward? How do we begin to create a new normal in our communal lives? How do we begin to actively and intentionally heal, individually and collectively? These are the questions that animate this year's Summer Solstice series. Our goal today is to set the stage for inquiry into these questions. Today, we will explore where we are and how we got here, and how we move forward with awareness and intention. We are very fortunate to be joined by a distinguished group of panelists who each bring a rich understanding of these issues to our conversation today. All three of our panelists lead full, interesting lives, and there is much more to say about them than I can today. But I will highlight the aspects of each of their lives' work that is relevant to our discussion today. We have with us Father Frank Coady, who is the pastor of St. Thomas More Catholic Church in Manhattan, Kansas, and director of the Office of Liturgy for the Catholic Diocese of Salina, Kansas. Frank has studied liturgy, practiced liturgy, and taught liturgy, and this immersion in liturgy has made him aware of the power of art and ritual to transcend normal routines and attitudes. He values the way that his roles as teacher and pastor support and inform each other. And he is known in our region for his sharp intellect and open heart. He is also known for his culinary skills, which he generously shares with others. Frank regularly speaks of love and generosity and forgiveness. He recognizes that these are countercultural positions that push back against our enduring habits of judgment. He's been a regular participant in the Summer Solstice series since its inception. We also have with us the Reverend Brian Ellison, who has served as executive director of the Covenant Network of Presbyterians since 2012, preaching, teaching, and providing overall strategic leadership. The Covenant Network of Presbyterians has worked since 1997 to engage, educate, and equip the church to be more inclusive of LGBTQIA+ people, and was part of the successful efforts to expand church policies around ordination and marriage in the early 2010s, with a focus on fostering and navigating difficult conversations and maintaining the unity of the church, even in disagreement. Much of Brian's work in the church has been focused on trying to build bridges between theological conservatives and liberals. In addition to his work with the Covenant Network of Presbyterians, Brian is the senior ecclesiastical officer of the Synod of Mid-America, which encompasses the Presbyterian Church USA congregations in Kansas, Missouri, and part of Illinois. He is also a host and contributor to KCUR, the national public radio station in Kansas City, where he lives with his partner, Troy. And we also have with us today Dr. Daniel Yudkin, a social psychologist who studies how people decide between right and wrong, and how these decisions impact relationships, organizations, and society. He is currently serving as a visiting scholar at the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania. Daniel is also Associate Director of Research at More in Common, a nonprofit organization that is committed to building inclusive societies and communities that are stronger and more resilient to the increasing threats of polarization and social division. In his work with More in Common, he brings insights from social science to understand the roots of political division and develop strategies to address these divisions. He is also an accomplished jazz pianist. He is committed to using the tools of social science to improve human interaction in society in hopes of helping humanity realize the best version of itself. So we have a wealth of wisdom and experience to borrow from these panelists today as we prepare to move to higher ground. I hope that our conversation today will itself model some of the powerful ideas that run through the life's work of each of our panelists, creating a space for exploring, curiosity about other ideas, willingness to be uncertain. So I'd like us to begin by asking each of our panelists to just talk briefly about themselves and their work, what brings each of them to a conversation like this and what they bring. And we'd also like each of them to talk briefly about how we arrived at this point of polarization and disconnection. Brian, I'm going to ask you to get us started.
Great, thanks, Paula. And I'm really honored to be part of this program and part of this panel. I wish we could be together in person, and I would love to learn a little about cooking from Father Frank and a little more about jazz piano from Dr. Daniel, but I guess we'll have to wait for that. So I am a Presbyterian minister. I was ordained in 1999, and that was just shortly after the Presbyterian Church put into its constitution a prohibition on the ordination of gay and lesbian people as ministers or as deacons and elders. I was a gay man, but was, and still am, of course, but was not being very honest with myself about that at the early stages of my ordination process, such that when I eventually was ordained, I did so in the hope that that would all just sort of somehow work out. Over time, the church continued to debate and wrestle with issues of LGBTQIA+ inclusion. And over time, I continued to serve as pastor of a church here in the Kansas City area. In 2011, the Presbyterian Church did eventually vote to change its constitution and allow for openly LGBTQ people to serve as ministers. It's around that time, actually, with the retirement of my predecessor as the executive director of the Covenant Network of Presbyterians, that I began to consider what the next call, the next opportunity might be for me. And I found myself in a conversation about becoming executive director of this group. The Covenant Network was founded just after that prohibition on ordination was put into the Presbyterian Book of Order, the Constitution. And throughout its history, the Covenant Network was trying to figure out how to change the church. It had an agenda, but to do that in a way that wasn't just about winning, that wasn't just about forcing the issue and changing the policy, but rather about maintaining the unity of the church in that process. I think the founders of the organization thought that was going to be a much shorter term project than it turned out to be. But they ended up working over the course of almost 15 years, putting on conferences, holding events, holding intentional dialogues, always trying to stand for justice and unity, trying to hold those things together. And so the ethos of this organization that I stepped into in 2012 has always been to try to bring people together with differing views and figure out how they can move forward together. The issue on the table when I started in 2012 was the next big question facing the church in this regard, which was about same-sex marriage and whether the church would bless those marriages. And I can talk a little bit about some of the ways that we went through the process of having those difficult conversations that eventually led to a change in the church's policy around those issues as well. One of the things that I have come to realize in doing this work is that the goal when I come together with people who hold a different view on these issues than I do, and just to be clear, even though the Presbyterian Church has changed its policies on those issues, that does not mean it is now a monolithic entity. I am still dealing on a daily basis with the reality that in many of our churches, in some regions of the country, and really in every region of the country to some degree, there is still disagreement around these issues. And those disagreements are not just sort of theological, philosophical differences. They are questions of meaning and identity, and individual people's lives are affected by the decisions people make about them. I'm still dealing with those issues, and we have found that the way to address them is not so much to try to persuade, not so much to try to win votes, but rather to engage. And so the mission of our organization has changed over the years, and today it is explicitly to engage, equip, and educate congregations and councils, gatherings of people and churches to move forward in conversation about these issues. We have an agenda, and one of the things that I try to be is completely transparent about that. We want to see a particular outcome, but we want that outcome to be the result of a process that builds everyone up, whether their mind is changed or not. And when it comes to changing minds and changing hearts, that happens less through a particular argumentation process and more through relationships, through connecting, through coming together and talking about the kind of world we want to see, the kind of church we want to be, and the kinds of people that we want to have, that we want ourselves to be, and that we want to have among us. This is hard work, and it is it takes the form of programs, it takes the form of events, but it takes the form of a whole lot of conversations, a whole lot of one-on-one engagement. And part of what we are trying to do now is make sure that we're setting people up for those one-on-one conversations that will take place not in our spaces, not on the phone with me sitting in my office, but in the hallways and the pews and the pulpits and the church board meetings all over the country every day, where people's lives are really being affected. And so that's a little glimpse of the work that I do with the Covenant Network, and the work that I feel called to do today, every bit as much as as back when we were debating church policies. That work really still continues in really significant and important ways. And I'll stop there, but we can talk more about those things as we go. Paula?
Thank you so much, Brian. Frank, let's go to you next.
Okay. Well, I'm a little older than Brian. I was ordained in 76 back in the last century. And so I'm 45 years out. And I have always considered myself a very fortunate priest in that I think when I was in seminary and in early ordination, I just presumed that I would be a pastor my whole life and that's all I would do. And I was happy with that, but I think I got kind of rescued by being sent on for further study. I wasn't thinking about that, but you know, in the Catholic Church, you do what you're told. So that's where I found myself. And so I had two different opportunities to do graduate school in Rome and several summers at Notre Dame. And that just opened my mind in so many ways. But one of the things that strikes me today is that, you know, in our church, and I think Presbyterian or any church, different generations conflict with each other, and theological views are not the same. And so I was forced to live with guys who were 15 years younger than myself, and to eat 3 meals a day with guys who disagree with you. After a while, you start hearing where they're coming from. And when I got back after 2 years of that, I was able to explain to my contemporaries why these guys thought the way they did, acted the way they did, dressed the way they do. And you know, it's not perfect, but it was kind of a blessing for me and my contemporaries that I shared that experience with them. Also, when I was a young priest, I was like all young people. I was so certain, you know, youth is it may not be experienced or bright, but it's certain, and so I was rather preachy, and of course people then put me in a box pretty quickly and said, oh well, he says that because that's the way he always talks, you know. And so I tried to back off from that over the years, and talk more about what's actually going on in people's lives rather than theological views or things like that, just relating the scriptures directly to their lived experience, which I shared because I was pastoring them and living among them. And so other preachers, I find, are much more political. They're much more focused in their theological presentation. And, you know, there's some value to that too. I think people need to be challenged, shocked out of their comfort zone from time to time. But over the years, that has just not become my style. I don't get into that stuff. And I think people in my parish know pretty much where I stand on issues, but I never bring that into the pulpit. I'm not saying it's wrong, but that's just where I have landed. And so I, you know, trying to see the other point of view, even when it's difficult. Over the years, I've tried to read columns in the opinion page that I know I'm going to dislike, and that's work. You know, we all have a tendency to feed ourselves on what we already think, and it's hard to look at the other point of view. And every once in a while, someone has pointed out something to me in conversation that I just really had to bite my tongue. I found that hard to listen to, and yet I think there's something that that makes that possible in me. And then one final thing I'll say is that one of the things that I do in the liturgy office is I do a lot of liturgical consultant work, which means that I work with architects and pastors and building committees, and indeed sometimes entire parish meetings on renovation and new building projects. And liturgy is a lightning rod. People get really upset about liturgy, and I often say that I hate that work, but I know I'm good at it. I know that I can be in a room full of 150 people who are shouting at each other about their opinions about, a renovation project. And I can remain calm, at least on the surface. I don't feel very calm on the inside, but on the surface, I can be a calming influence in that room. And I've been told that enough times that I stay with it, even though every project I say, this is my last one, I'm not doing this anymore. But kind of not a peacemaker. I don't think of myself as a peacemaker, but I think of myself more as a facilitator who can at least get people to hear each other, not necessarily to agree, but at least to be willing to shut up for a couple of minutes and let the other person or the other side have their point of view. So I'll end with that.
Thank you, Frank. Daniel.
Yes, thank you, Paula. First, I just want to thank the First Presbyterian for having us and for just being interested in engaging in these types of conversations. I think these kinds of conversations are some of the most challenging to have, especially when you're confronting and navigating issues, putting yourself, as Father said, outside your comfort zone. People like to be in safe cocoons, and that's certainly more pleasant, but maybe you learn a little bit less, and you have less of a rich understanding of the world when you stay in that. So I just want to thank everyone for being here and for being in this space, which is a little bit more difficult, but maybe also more edifying. My story. So a couple things I can say. First of all, so I'm a social psychologist by training. I got my PhD in social psychology from New York University in 2017. And throughout the course of that that education, I was always interested in morality, in particular, how people decide between right and wrong and all the implications that has for so many aspects of human life. The decisions that we make about right and wrong are simultaneously some of the hardest decisions that we make and also the most consequential. And so how people navigate that and how moral issues get hashed out in society and in conversations between people, I think is some of the most sort of interesting, one of the more interesting limits of social science. So I was always really interested in this topic. And it was right around the end, closing in the end of my 5th year, I believe, of graduate school, that I had an experience that brought that that slightly theoretical and abstract study much closer to home. And the story is that, I was born in Massachusetts. My family's Jewish. My family is very liberal, and I was always sort of brought up in progressive liberal thinking. My mother was born in Nebraska, and she has a great deal of family in Kansas. In fact, my grandpa was born in Kansas and grew up on a farm in outside of Wichita, Kansas. And I had visited my grandparents in Nebraska several times after they retired, but I'd never been to Kansas. And one day, as I said, as I was nearing the end of my graduate school, I got a letter in the mail that was an invitation to the 50th anniversary of the Miles family reunion. Now, Miles is the last name of my grandfather, and so this was basically an opportunity to have a conversation and to meet many of the members of my extended family who I'd never met before. And so I ended up agreeing with my mom and my sister to fly. We flew into Wichita, and we ended up driving about an hour and a half outside of Wichita to a very, very small town. I don't know if y'all know this town because it's so small, but Iuka, Kansas was this little community center in Iuka, Kansas. I looked it up. It's about 2 hours drive from Salina. And there I ended up having there was all these sort of foods that I had never eaten before, Jello salad and bean casserole. And I ended up, I went into that experience with a little bit of trepidation, I'll be honest, because, I wasn't sure this was a world that I had never really been a part of before. And from the stories that people tell in Massachusetts about people from Kansas, they're all carrying AR-15s and, driving around on tractors, who knows, this is a bit of it's a new world, but it was an opportunity for me to really get to know people in a way. And these are people that I'm related to. These are part of my family. And I ended up having many, many really interesting conversations with members of my own family and people saying, we make our bed and tie our shoes just like you. It's not so different over here. So that was a learning moment for me, because it in a way it took these theoretical ideas that I had been learning about differences in morality that I'd been studying in graduate school, and really brought them down to earth to me in a really personal way. And I emerged from that experience with a greater sense of respect and understanding for people that, from the perspective of, the media might be portrayed as very different or even bad, and so that was an experience that then led me to just start to think about ways that I could apply this study of morality to thinking about how it manifests and plays out in society, in particular vis-a-vis political polarization, which of course we're all very much living in right now. And so from that, it was only a year or two later that I joined forces with the organization More in Common. More in Common at the time was a very new organization that essentially was beginning to start to use the tools of social science and the tools of social psychology to try to better understand how people disagree, why people disagree, and ultimately through that understanding potentially make progress and facilitate a better level of compassion and understanding between people on different sides of the ideological spectrum. And so it was through that, and in collaboration with More in Common, that we began a study, which ended up being known as the Hidden Tribes Study. It involved 8,000 Americans surveyed across the United States. We asked them a variety of different questions about what their beliefs were and how those beliefs kind of manifested in their identity. And I think in particular, what stood out about this study is there's all kinds of survey polls, Pew Research, Gallup polls that do a lot of surveys of Americans, of course. But this study, I think, was different from the ones that had come before because of its emphasis on what we called core beliefs. Core beliefs are beliefs informed through social psychology and social science that sort of come before the beliefs you might have about immigration or gun control. These are sort of underlying views that shape the way that people see the world, including what their moral values are, the amount of threat they perceive in the world, what their parenting philosophy is, their views about personal agency and responsibility. Some of these underlying views that can have really shape in important ways the political views that we have. And so through this analysis of core beliefs, we ended up, generating an analysis that to me was very kind of revealing and really helped me to understand and think about the political landscape that we're living in a new way. And so I'm just gonna, if you don't mind, just quickly share my screen to give you a sense of what our findings were. So the common narrative if you follow the media, if you in popular discourse right now, is that what we're in the middle of is a war between two sides. You have red states and blue states. You have left and right. You have conservative and you have liberal. And what our study showed is that, in fact, actually, this is really not what's going on at all. In fact, what we discovered is 7 different groups of people, what we call tribes, that are united in their core beliefs, but certainly don't conform to the standard typical left-right divide that we typically think of. So we have progressive activists, traditional liberals, passive liberals, politically disengaged, moderates, traditional conservatives, and devoted conservatives. And so the very first thing that we learned first was that the typical narrative of left versus right is just far more complex than is typically given credit for. But that's not the only thing we learned. We also did an analysis of how active people are on things like social media, how engaged they are. What we found is that the most extreme ideological groups, specifically the progressive activists and the devoted conservatives, which actually make up less than 15% of the American population, are by far the most active and engaged and vocal people in the social and political discourse. In other words, they are taking up the vast majority of the volume on the airwaves when we log into social media, when we read the news, or when we watch the news on TV. What we're seeing oftentimes are the voices of the people on the very, very far ends of this political spectrum, what we call the wings. The vast majority of the country, in fact, actually falls into a group of people we term the exhausted majority. The exhausted majority is a group of people who are really not as active necessarily on social media. They're not necessarily as likely to voice their opinion. They're much more open-minded and interested in learning about opposing people's views. And they're more flexible. They're more and also more open and desiring of compromise. They want people to find common ground. And in fact, 67% of the population actually falls into this group, the exhausted majority, this group in the middle that's not on the wings. And so that, I think, really helped me to really understand sort of what's going on in America right now, where, you know, we are often given this idea that we have these two warring sides, but really that is a strong minority of the country. In fact, the vast majority of people in the country are much more reasonable and flexible and compassionate in their views. And I think that by realizing how many Americans, how many of us fall in that group, I think can really help to maybe bring a little bit more optimism to this seemingly polarized world that we live in. And so the two sort of main things that I bring to the table and have two, lessons that I've learned over the past several years of work in this field is, number one, it's really important to understand people's core beliefs, what they bring to the table, the underlying philosophical and psychological beliefs that shape the way that they see the world, and it's important to incorporate those into any conversation that you have with somebody, because that is oftentimes what's driving seeming differences between political views. And that second, that most Americans are not really members of these very tribalized and polarized groups. In fact, many more Americans fall into a group that has a lot more in common than they really think. And so I will end it there and stop sharing my screen and turn it back over to you, Paula.
Oh, thank you so much. What wonderful introductions to what this topic and what each of you bring. And As we go forward from here, I hope that all three of you will feel comfortable jumping in, because that's will be the rich part here is a conversation between the three of you. But so I'd like to throw out a question to get us started. The work that all three of you do, and you've hinted at this, each of you already, references the idea of something greater, perhaps a unifying force or a transcendent understanding that can help as we face our differences. And I'm wondering if each of you could say a little bit more about that. What is that something greater in your work, and how do we access it? And how can we draw this out in relationships between people who may not have such an obvious connection to each other? So either anybody who would like to jump in there, please go ahead.
Well, I'll jump in. I'm suddenly drawing a blank on the author's name, but he said, Americans love to search for happiness. Viktor Frankl. But he said, happiness can't be found. It can't be purchased. It can't be manipulated. Happiness is a byproduct of worship. And he describes worship in a kind of a generic sense as giving yourself over to something larger than yourself. So he gives the example of docents in a museum, or, candy stripers in a hospital, or, any kind of volunteer work makes people happy. But you can also extend that to parenting, to falling in love, that you're suddenly more absorbed in someone outside of you than you are in yourself. And you discover almost as a byproduct that you're happy. And so you don't work for happiness. You give yourself and you become happy. Well, this is gospel, isn't it? I mean, Jesus says in so many different ways, the only way to gain your life is to lose your life. The only way to be first is to be last. And, this is what he was getting at, I think. And so, and of course, Jesus gives us the prime example, I think. He spends his life not about his own will, but the Father's will. And he's more concerned about the others around him than himself, and all the way to the death, all the way to the cross. And I think that is really at the heart of what it means to be one of his followers, to be a Christian. If you somehow don't get this piece about giving yourself, self-offering, then somehow you're not Christian. You've missed the point. And but also you're never going to be happy. You can say this in terms of moralistic terms or theological terms, but also you can say this in psychological or social terms too, that this is the way to happiness. This is the kingdom now, not some abstract kingdom in the future, but the kingdom now, realized now, because you can actually be living the redeemed life and be happy here. So I'll stop there, and the other two can pick up on that or take another direction. That's fine too.
No, I think it's very much the same direction for me. I guess I would have similar to what you just said, Frank. I think I have a religious answer and a less religious answer, but I think they're not as far apart as it might seem. The religious answer, I think of the great statement of faith, the Westminster Catechism in our Reformed tradition, that the first question is, what is the chief end of humanity? What is its main purpose? And it says to glorify God and enjoy God forever. The challenge is what is it that we think glorifies God? That's where we end up disagreeing. And I resonate a lot with Daniel talking about core beliefs, because really what you think is good, what you think glorifies God, to put it in religious terms, is going to sort of trigger your responses to all the rest of the questions. And so, I always say that the work we do is about the gospel. And the gospel is about love, or the gospel is about justice. But there are others who say the gospel is about purity. The gospel is about making choices that reflect a transformed life, and therefore they're going to frame the question differently, even if we say it's all about the gospel or it's all about doing good or glorifying God. One of the ways I sort of try to get at that with folks, and it involves genuinely listening on my part, is to sort of dig in when it's easier actually when someone identifies something that they say is the wrong thing than when they are actually trying to elucidate the right thing, because I think we all sort of lift up the same set of values or different words about love and justice and goodness. But when someone goes so far as to say that among their core beliefs is that something is wrong, something is bad, something is a reflection of evil or fallenness, I try to get at what it is that they think makes it so. So in our, obviously in my work, as I've shared, the issue has often been around homosexuality. People can quote Bible verses. People can offer explanations. And one of the things I try to ask is, okay, you believe this is wrong. Talk with me about what is wrong with it. Why is it wrong? And often I think we can actually come to a place where we find agreement. Is there something that we found to be exploitive? Is there something that we found to be rooted in something other than love or covenant faithfulness or fidelity? What I often then try to do is turn it back around to what is right, and how do maybe other kinds of relationships than the ones that you've been thinking about reflect these values that you say are the good thing, the examples of love and faithfulness and mutuality and self-sacrifice. And often I think where we can turn the conversation from naming the wrong to lifting up the right, we're more likely to find common ground, because obviously in my view, there's a lot of relationships that are that were once labeled by the church as untraditional or immoral, that I think lift up values that the church has long celebrated today. The non-religious answer, although there was a little bit of non-religion in that, but the non-religious answer actually comes from the other hat that Paula mentioned I sometimes wear, working with the NPR station here in Kansas City. Just last week, I was hosting our talk show, and we had an interview with John Green. Maybe you know John Green. He's the author of The Fault in Our Stars and number of other books, and he has a new book out which is based on his podcast, The Anthropocene Reviewed, where he reviews all these things in life, from Diet Dr. Pepper to Canada geese to the Indianapolis 500, but also things like our capacity for wonder and sunsets. And you learn pretty quickly that what he's looking at is not actually these little cultural artifacts. He's actually finding in everything, big and small, the signs of hope, the signs of newness and redemption. And even in the midst of suffering or struggle or evil, the ways that human beings find a way forward, find a way to shine, to make new life in the midst of death. And I think there is the other thing that for me is that common ground that Paula, you asked about, this idea that we would together, and you don't have to be a Christian or of any particular religious perspective to be in this place, I think, but to look at our human-centered planet and say, here are all these examples of ways that the goodness can be found, the hope shines through. And I think that to me is another way of talking about how we find a higher principle or a common good.
Thank you. Daniel, what can you share with us?
Yeah, well, it's a great question. I have two things I'd like to share. The first is, I've been recently involved in some research that is looking at what we call transformative experiences that people have that lead them to feel removed from the everyday state of mind, something that transports them or helps them to transcend the everyday. And these kinds of experiences can happen in a variety of different contexts. They can be religious in nature. They can be totally secular in nature. They can happen, for example, we've actually collected some data at mass gatherings when people come together for a common purpose and are kind of in these very intense, highly intense social experiences. A lot of people have experiences they find to be transformative. They can happen in response to art or nature. But there's something that's really interesting about what all these experiences have in common across these different experiences that people have. There's oftentimes, I'll just pause. Yeah, no worries.
That's me, I'm sorry.
No problem. Just leave people on the edge of their seat. What is it? What's the thing they have in common? So the thing they have in common is that there is this underlying sense of connectedness, that human beings are more connected and have more in common than our day-to-day experience would suggest. There's a feeling of unity, a unity to nature, a unity to the universe, and a unity and an underlying sense of unity and commonality among all things. And so when people have these psychological experiences that lead them to transcend their everyday experience, they find that they come back with a sense of realization about how connected and how much they have in common with everybody else and how connected human beings really are. I think that's really profound. And it's for anyone, it's anyone's guess, when people have an experience they consider to be transformative, whether they're recovering some sense of whether that experience is what we might call veridical. Is it capturing the truth, or is it a hallucination? Who knows? But there's something really important about that. And I think I take that and I believe it. And when I apply that to the current world that we live in, I end up thinking about all the ways in which people are mischaracterized or caricatured to each other through the traditional media sources that we have. When people are not interacting, we're living in some of the research here suggests that we are living in a time in which not only are people so politically polarized, but they're also geographically separated. We are encountering less and less people with whom we disagree. We are isolating ourselves in metropolitan areas, which end up being sort of heavily democratic, and then more rural areas or certain pockets of the country become much more Republican, and people the line between one and the other is becoming more sharply defined. And so when we learn about the people that we seem to disagree with, we're learning about them through a filter of maybe this person said that, it's a rumor, it's something that you learn on social media, it's through the news. And these are filtered, caricatured versions of who those people really are. And so I think, one thing that I think is really important to keep in mind is that oftentimes when we look to try to transcend difference, especially in our politically polarized era, is to try to cut through that filter and really start to think about who the person really is and what their intentions are. And when you cut away that filter, I think you end up finding how much shared values and shared experiences there really are.
I'd like to ask a little bit more about that. That's such a beautiful idea about this connection that we can feel, that is transformative. This sense of wonder that we are more alike than not alike. And you mentioned some of these social gatherings, and I know from your research you've done work at Burning Man, for example. But I wonder how in our normal lives can we create more experiences like that are transformative, that help us access that kind of wonder?
Yeah, well, that's a great question. And I should say, actually, one really interesting finding from our research as you mentioned, we did go to Burning Man. I think I myself have been to Burning Man, and I find it to be just a fascinating, from a social psychological standpoint, fascinating place to go. To find out more about human nature, how people are when you wipe the slate clean in a lot of ways. But one thing that we found from that, and we compared people's experiences at Burning Man to a variety of other different events and gatherings and music festivals, is that Burning Man is not special in that way. In fact, actually, the experiences that people have of transcendence can happen. You don't need to go to a festival in the middle of the desert in Nevada to have an experience of connection. They can happen through a book group. You have a conversation about a friend of mine just decided to organize a philosophical reading club. And what we're doing is we're reading very short, accessible 5-page excerpts of philosophy, and we're going to get together and talk about what they mean to us. And I think that's in a very small way an effort towards potentially creating that sense of transcending the everyday and thinking about and it's that transcendence that immediately fosters a sense of connection. That's a weird thing where you immediately, as soon as you get outside your daily routine, you immediately feel more connected to the people around you. And so that they almost go hand in hand. And so little things that people can do in a community, within a community, getting together and talking about things that are important to you, your values or challenges in life, or other things you've learned, I think can have in their own way the effect of creating this sense of transcendence, which then creates a feeling of connectedness.
It's interesting to me that, yes, it doesn't have to be Burning Man, but it does have to be a place where people come together, where somehow it isn't something you can do alone in your own room. You can't read those same philosophical readings and come to the same magical outcomes without engaging with someone else about them.
I think that's true. I think relationships help, but I would say, people talk. We've done some research on people who travel alone in nature. So you're certainly right. Well, in your room, yeah. But a walk in the Rocky Mountains by yourself, can't you go on a camping trip for 2 days in the Rocky Mountains, and you have an experience that leads you to feel much more connected to nature. Yeah. I can't testify, and I don't think we don't have enough data to show whether that particular experience also fosters a sense of social connectedness. Because I think that in that, a 2-day hike in the Rockies might lead you feeling more connected to nature. But I think it's an open question whether it leaves you feeling connected to social to others. So I think your point is well taken, but I think the jury's still out actually on that one.
No, I appreciate that, and I think, we're going to get into the introvert extrovert thing, but I think there's probably value in both kinds of connection, and maybe everybody needs to have a little of each. But it occurs to me that again, with my NPR hat on, I spend a lot of time covering politics and government, especially in Missouri, which has become as divisive, as bifurcated as probably any state over the last decade. It didn't used to be that way, by the way. Missouri used to be this moderate bellwether state, and all of the politicians talked about how close they were with each other across the aisle and the good things they did when they worked together. And it's similar to what we've seen on a national level, but maybe even more intensely in Missouri. We've sort of seen this dramatic shift to complete separation of blue and red. And it's very telling to me that one of the things I hear from state representatives and state senators, they almost to a person say it. I used to have a podcast where they'd come on and I'd interview them one-on-one, and almost every one of them would say, we just don't talk with each other anymore. We can't. There's almost social pressure not to talk across the aisle for fear, I guess, that it would that it might break down the defenses, that the walls might actually come down. The very thing that we're sort of taking as an assumed good in this conversation is the very thing that the social pressure is now in place to avoid, because for fear that it might weaken or somehow soften the intensity of the political feelings. And I think that's very telling. There is something about that relationships are even scary if they might actually end up softening people's hearts.
I'd like to take us in a little different direction. We've been talking about looking for those things that we might have in common or experiences that we could share together. And I'd like to ask you, the three of you, about the value of focusing on differences. You know, what do we do about the reality of our differences, and how do we work with them well? And Frank, you mentioned that experience you had in Rome, having to eat meals regularly with people who had very different ideas than you did. What would you say was the value of that for you? What is the benefit of confronting differences?
Well, for one thing, it enlarged me because I think I was opened kind of by force to some ideas and ways of being that I hadn't entertained before. And I've often thought, I don't know that they learned as much from me as I did from them. But that was the fault of youth again. Youth is so certain of itself. I think that they felt like they converted me, and they did, you know. But so it'd be interesting to talk to some of them now. That was 25 years ago, to see whether they even remember me or whether they remember some of our conversations. But I would say the biggest thing I remember out of it is feeling enlarged in my own viewpoint.
Yeah, I feel like the acknowledgement of differences, the admission that there are differences, is perhaps the first difficult thing that has to happen. And maybe the only way to move forward is to be honest and authentic about those differences. I'm mindful of one of the major parts of my work for about a year, when the Presbyterian Church was debating same-sex marriage. I traveled around the country to about 10 different regional gatherings, together with the leader of the organization whose values were the ones opposed to mine. This was the group that was trying to maintain the church's traditional position on marriage as only a man and a woman. And we actually spoke in the same events back to back, had a little shtick even at all of these regional gatherings, often on the same occasion when they were about to vote on the issue. And we traveled around, and we would joke with each other. We would correct each other gently. We showed the people that we were actually friends. And what seemed to happen as a result is that, I don't know that either of us persuaded anyone in that group to take our side. It wasn't structured like a political debate for and against. But what it showed was that we were able, after we've acknowledged our differences, to have a real conversation. And I think the quality of the conversation, which historically in the church has often been angry and bitter and involved a lot of name calling and misunderstanding and diminishing of the other side, in those places, I think was a much higher quality conversation, one where people's lived out their values in the way they conducted themselves, because we'd given permission to disagree. We'd acknowledged that differences were part of who we are. I think the other key thing that happened in those conversations is, having acknowledged the differences, being able to say, and we will both still be here when this is all over. We're not going to take our Bible and go home. And so part of the acknowledgement of differences is naming that those differences are not so great that we cannot continue to be in relationship. Now, I want to acknowledge, though, that there is maybe a shallowness to what I'm saying, which is that sometimes the differences are greater than that. So I'll be honest about that. But a lot of what we disagree about isn't the case. And I think we need to find those places where we can say, we're going to keep disagreeing about this, but we will both still be here.
You know, I've always admired people who dialogue, you know, the interreligious dialogues between the world religions. I know that's very hard work, and it can be tedious. I saw a movie last night, The Human Factor, about the negotiators, the American negotiators during the peace talks in Israel, or about Israel, the Camp David Accord and that sort of thing. And it was a very enlightening film. But one of the things I took away from that is, if Yasser Arafat had given in on this one point, he would have been dead within a week, because his constituents would have been so upset. And you mentioned that in Missouri, you know, where it's kind of the constituents who are saying, you can't give in because you'll give away my position. Isn't that what you're saying, Brian?
Yeah, I think that's right.
Yeah. And so when you're really in heavy stakes, like the situation you're in, Brian, or certainly that whole Israeli situation, the stakes are so high. And so it's very, very difficult to come to a reasonable, respectful dialogue. And I admire, Brian, the way you've been able to do that, because that's not an easy dialogue either, that whole LGBTQ issue in the churches, and in the culture too, but certainly in the churches. It's just a volatile issue. And you've come a lot farther on that than the Catholic Church has. We're still we're breaking into the 19th century.
Well, and one of the another obvious difference between the Presbyterian and the Catholic churches in this matter is that is the way we make decisions, right? And where authority is lodged. And you know, I am operating on this sort of idealistic idea that the people who come to the table are coming on basically equal footing, that all of the voices will be heard and we will make a decision together. In fact, we vote on majority votes, you know, and so it is recognizably a very different system than
Yeah.
Catholic Church polity. But you know, there's a certain relatability in, I think, the way the Catholic Church is structured that reflects something that is probably true of Presbyterians and society as well, which is that there are imbalances of power. Mm-hmm. There are times where it's not just a matter of all the ideas coming equally to the table and then the best one emerges. You know, sometimes some voices have more weight than others. Not everyone is the Pope, not everyone is the bishop. But even if you don't carry those titles, there are other ways that people have power. Mm-hmm. You know, I'm frankly mindful that part of why I have power in this discussion is that I was in the church, ordained and in rising up to leadership positions before I came out of the closet. And I still enjoy a certain privilege that is a straight person's privilege, because even though I'm out now, I attained some of those things at an earlier stage. There are folks who can't have the kinds of conversations I can have because that power is not accorded to them, that there is not an openness. And I really do think we have to be attentive to that. This isn't just about all the ideas and affirming each other's differences, as though that didn't also come down to people's identity and the challenges that are placed on them, the inequities that are built into anytime we have dialogue.
Yeah, that whole power thing is it's an interesting part of the dynamic.
Daniel, Would you weigh in on some of that? I know that your work has looked at all of those kinds of issues, differences, power dynamics.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, so one thing that occurred to me when you asked this question, how boring would the world be if we all thought exactly the same thing? You know, like there's gonna be some difference, and you know, progressing in society is always going to involve a degree of navigating those differences and finding ways of living together and working together and cooperating despite those differences. I think, Brian, what you're doing is amazing, partly because what you're doing is you're modeling for people what cooperative disagreement actually looks like. A lot of people, I think, don't really know how to be when and how to act and how to talk in situations in which they disagree with somebody. And perhaps in their lives, the only types of disagreements that they've encountered are ones that end in that are essentially mutually incompatible. You just can't be in the same room as the person. They need to either be resolved or you just can't work together. And I think finding and navigating that much more challenging space of working together through disagreement and continuing to test the limits of that and find ways of areas of agreement, and you know, that's where the hard work is. And I think the fact that you're modeling that for people is just really, really important. And I think it's a skill really that people, and an attitude that is far too rare in society right now, the ability to cooperate and disagree. The other thing I just wanted to say about this is, you know, I think we're living in a time, you could almost call it like a crisis of recognition. So what do I mean by that? I think we're living in a time when a lot of people think that the way that you engage with someone is by talking rather than by listening. You know, social media is about saying what you think, and that maybe less about hearing and listening what other people have to say. And we often just neglect how important it is to just sit and listen to what a person has to say. And in fact, studies have suggested that, you know, skills of active listening, open-minded listening, of asking questions and just sitting there, not saying anything, just letting the person say what they have to say, letting them express and feel and be recognized. You know, that's incredibly powerful. And
it's so hard.
It's so hard.
You know, I think that part of this is it's about dying. Willingness to die, to willingness to lose and make oneself vulnerable. And again, I think this is modeled by Jesus. The making of oneself as vulnerable and at risk, and at the service of another. And that involves, I think, in dialogue, a dying to my hardline position, a dying to what I have always thought and held to so tightly that I am willing to let go of that. And I think that, you know, Paula, you asked me what that did for me when I was forced to be with others who disagreed with me. I think what happened in me is some of the hardness died. And that's what made me grow, and that's what made me happy about the whole experience, is because losing is winning. And so happiness is a byproduct. And I certainly wasn't thinking of myself as happy at the time, but it occurred, you know.
Oh, thank you. We are nearing the end of our time, but I wanted to ask you all, as we wrap up here, has your work led you to formulate any kind of core value or guiding principle that you might want to help us end with today, that you could share with us as we try to move toward finding higher ground? Anyone jump in?
I'm happy to jump in if you want. In undergrad, I was a philosophy major, and I came to psychology by way of philosophy. I found that psychology was a way of using science to answer some philosophical questions. I have been thinking a lot about the philosopher George Hegel recently, and so this is a sincere answer to your question. I've been really thinking a lot about this philosopher George Hegel, and one of his main philosophical contributions is this idea of the dialectic, and the dialectic being what he suggested as this joining, the idea of a joining of the thesis and the antithesis joined into a synthesis. And he suggested that the progress of history is marked by the reconciliation or integration of seemingly contradictory ideas that seem as though they are contradictory, but actually can be integrated or seen in a new way that actually renders them not contradictory. Or compatible. And I've been thinking a lot about that and what implications it can have for the world that we're living in right now. I think a lot of people could benefit from thinking less in terms of black and white or this or that, but more in terms of this and that. And I think I also want to say it's not always the case. Sometimes like there is a right and a wrong. Mm-hmm. I think that Brian, I think that you can probably relate to that, but yeah, so just thinking about times that the gray zone is the right zone, and a both and rather than a either or, I think is right. I've been looking for opportunities for that, and that's just the lesson that I've taken from my research.
Thank you so much. That was wonderful.
Yeah.
Frank?
Well, sort of piggybacking on your situation there, Daniel. How many people get an undergraduate degree in philosophy today? And I think that's one of our biggest problems in our culture is the humanities are not being studied in our universities. We study business, or engineering. And as important as those fields are and everything, I think that our culture is impoverished by the lack of the humanities that encourage us to think about these larger issues, and to make these connections that you're making, Daniel. There was a time in our country when medical doctors had to get an undergraduate degree in philosophy before they could go to medical school. And the reason was because in these small rural communities, and we were a rural agrarian culture back then, they were the only educated person in town. And so they had to advise people on a whole range of fields, not just medicine. So they had to have this larger viewpoint. And I think that one of the reasons clergy often studied philosophy is for the same reason, because lots of times in these small communities, they were the only educated person. And so they had to be the one person in town who could see the big picture. And I just think that our culture is we don't have enough big picture people, and it's hurting us. I'll leave it at that.
Brian. Thank you, Frank.
I think the core belief, and I hope that it doesn't sound too simplistic, that I really come back to again and again is love. It's which, as it turns out, has the nice feature of having been what Jesus said it is all about as well. Love one another. And I think that's a very complicated instruction. Not at all obvious what it means to fulfill it, but the pursuit of figuring out what it means to fulfill it is a worthy way to spend your life. And I think in the context of this discussion, when there is disagreement, when there are differences, when there is division, paying attention to what love demands of you toward the person who is across that divide, what love demands of you with regard to the people on your same side of the divide. You know, there, as Daniel said, there is right and wrong, and sometimes in the name of dialogue, in the name of building bridges, there's a temptation to sort of throw people under the bus on your side that I don't think is loving either. And so it's a hard thing, this core principle I'm naming. But if we all were to pursue it, if that was how we were to approach our division and our differences, thinking in terms of how we can best serve the other, what will best advance the life and well-being of each other person, I think we would be in a better place. And as complicated as that is, I think it's worth trying to do.
Oh, well, what a great note for us to end on. Thank you all so much for this rich conversation today. Really appreciate your time and wisdom. Thank you very much. And please stay tuned for the next installation of Summer Solstice on June 30th. You can go to the website of the First Presbyterian Church of Salina to learn more of the details. Thank you again.
Thank you, Paula.
Thank you.
Thank you.